I would like to welcome a new sponsor to the channel, Fume. Fume helps people switch from a bad habit to a good habit. Fume is a diffusive device that allows you to breathe through the Fume device and enjoy various flavors. But switching to Fume is easy, enjoyable, and even fun. Fume has served over 100,000 customers and has thousands of success stories, and there's no reason that cannot be you. Fume just recently released some new cores on its website on June 30th. Orange Vanilla, which is sweet and citrusy with a touch of classic vanilla, Raspberry Lemon, which is a full-bodied lemonade with hints of berries, and Sparkling Grapefruit, which is fresh and cooling grapefruit. Not only are these new cores tasty, they're easy to install, because the Fume features an adjustable airflow, which is great to fidget with, and it's also just easy to use. It even makes a nice clicking sound. Join Fume in accelerating humanity's breakup from destructive habits by picking up the Journey Pack today. Head to tryfume.com/nerdslayer or scan the QR code and use code nerdslayer to get 10% off when you get the Journey Pack today. That's tryfum.com and use code nerdslayer to save an additional 10% off of your order today. Now let's get to the mystery. I've been recently covering things like socialization and online RPGs generally. Keyword online RPGs. This topic is incredibly complex, personal to me, fascinating to me, and so incredibly impactful in society. I even did a video nobody watched or responded to despite being a literal how-to explain how social design works, and instead got a bulk of my comments on my more recent editorial video, Solo Boy MMO, where people demonstrated a lack of understanding the content material there, and the entire how-to video that I made before it. When I mentioned online RPGs and MMORPGs separately, people have conflated that to just mean that all online RPGs are MMORPGs, aka the massive variant of them, as if RPGs that went online for the first time had visions or even any idea of being massive or wanting to even be massive. Or the idea that you could just skip the entire technology required to do such, right? It's a bit silly. Because they make this conflation, they believe being a particular kind of player is shunned or not supported, or even, in some cases, discriminated against. For example, specifically by me or my language in my last video, for example, since apparently properly classifying a game is for some reason an insult or attack on it or people who play such a game, which is more indicative of the fragility and anti-intellectualism rampant in society. Worse, people think that they can close their ears to the fact that there are clear differences between massive online RPGs and non-massive online RPGs. But why do developers and such seem to account for that then in their designs? It's gotten sad to the point that people think it's me dying on a hill when I want to educate people on how these games are being designed and how they've been designed historically. In some cases, there's developers telling the player base what their game is, like PoE saying it's not an MMO, or Guild Wars, or Phantasy Star Online, or Warframe, and so on and so forth, and they're still ignored. But the history is already there, despite some of you closing your ears to developers' explanations or mini videos I might have done on the subject, and then being insulting about it for some reason. This will be detailed in this video and more. I also got comments that were not only contradicting the creator of the game that people were for some reason defending, despite me not attacking the game in any way, Final Fantasy XIV. I had a few literally saying, well, you're taking Yoshi P's word too seriously, and he's divisive, so basically implying that a player of the game knows more than Yoshi P does about the game, or even designing games in general. Which is just weird, guys. You don't have to defend your favorite game. It's doing perfectly fine right now, arguably sitting on top of the top 3 slot, maybe even number 1. So why the persecution complex while at the top? And why slag on the creator, who understands the concepts that I'm outlining here? I will say though, while I've done some videos on what an MMORPG, the non-massive version of an online RPG is, and on massive online RPGs, I did a poor job in my last video of covering it again, which led to some confusion. I take full responsibility anytime that happens, it just means that I kinda sucked, or just sucked. But the truth is not all online RPGs are massive, nor try to be, nor have ever tried to be always. Many of the games that I reference in my videos aren't and don't try to be. That's more so an obsession that fans or players seem to have, but just because you close your ears to it doesn't change the fact that calling them all the same type of game is not really that helpful since they have clear differences and focuses. Just like any other time in history where people have become obsessed with an umbrella term, it never really goes well. There's too much nuance that ends up getting lost in such a term. The majority of content in games like Guild Wars 2, Final Fantasy XIV, and SWTOR, for example, are small scale or for solo play, which is totally fine. I repeat, it's totally fine, because those games aren't actually trying to be massive. That's the entire point. If they were, then you could actually be critical of them for not being massive. And if you're responding with defenses of zones being capped at a few hundred players, if you even knew that, by the way, I think you're missing the point by a few miles. So what's the issue here exactly? Well, honestly, the issue is that people don't recognize that virtual worlds or online RPGs as being as incredibly complex as they are, and not all being the same type of game. Yes, that means that coming up with distinguishing terminology is not only helpful, it's accurate in the case of distinguishing an online world that wants to be massive and one that doesn't. It's relevant because these similar styles of game don't have the same ultimate goals and thus attract different types of players. They also, specifically due to their architecture, perform better at specific aspects of gaming and enjoyment. The MUD industry, which came previously, for example, in the 80s and 90s, had dozens of names within it. Meanwhile, people suddenly want MMORPG to mean and classify all online RPGs, which is just silly, has no historical precedence, and just makes no logical sense. Now, despite the cheeky name of this video and my overall tone, which is more about me taking the piss out of people being obsessed with thinking I hate non-massive online RPGs merely because they're the most dominant ones right now, so I'm talking about them the most, or that there even needs to be a competition between these two styles of games, and I'm also trying to attempt to educate people about why and how it's been so lacking lately. So ultimately, I have no desire to pick sides, I have only desires to educate everybody on what the sides actually are. MMORPG versus MMORPG is more of a question of specific game design and ultimately individual preference. There is no better. However, they do perform better at what they specialize at, which just kind of makes sense, right? And I'll go more into detail about that later. In this video, I will detail the differences between the two styles of online RPGs in direct comparison with each other, as I have already done in individual videos for both MMORPG or ORPG and then MMORPG, and why it's ultimately relevant from a design perspective, which means sorry, can the feels guys, for a second at least. Now, if you'd like to engage in discussion on this subject, I recommend joining our discord.gg/nerdslayer. While we appreciate comments and discussion as always, especially as a form of support, the comments never really can be taken too seriously, so take that as you will. And if you're confused why that is, I recommend just spending some time in a comment section to learn some perspective. The comment sections are for sharing experiences or debating the topic at hand though, that's for sure. You don't have to combine these two at the same time, however, as it leads to a poor showing of both oftentimes. For example, saying you feel emotionally different than I do doesn't dispute the topic at hand, right? Just like a logical argument doesn't disprove people's experiences. See what I mean? Anyway, enough logical talk, let's get to the meat. I won't spend too much time doing an origin story work here, since I have already done videos dedicated to the origins of both the types of games. However, it's important to note that MMORPG as a term has a very interesting history that a majority aren't too aware of. For starters, MUDs or multi-user dungeons were the first form of online RPG. These games ranged from text-based to partial graphics, but contrary to popular belief, actually had full-blown graphics in the case of graphical MUDs in the late 90s. Problem being, MUD and graphical MUD were more turbo nerd terms and didn't do the best job of explaining to the layman what to expect. Richard Garriott, an early online RPG and RPG pioneer, decided when selling his online game based on Ultima Online, that they would dub the game an MMORPG, standing for Massive Multiplayer Online RPG. The largest reason for this term being invented in 1999 was for marketing purposes, as massive served as a fantastic word for such. But the idea also behind these games were that they were supposed to be bigger, more ambitious than the genre that came before. More massive, if you will, even if massive itself is kind of hard to quantify. Contrary to popular belief, MMORPG didn't become the only term used until the blockbuster EverQuest and then subsequent blockbuster World of Warcraft blew up. Before then, and I have read media of the time including books written about online RPGs, people were calling online RPGs really all sorts of things. Synthetic world, artificial world, virtual world, online RPG, multiplayer online RPG, massive multiplayer online game, cooperative RPG, and many more names and terms were circulating around the time. However, what's interesting about the term MMORPG and the early ones is that all MMORPGs or pioneer MMORPGs were capable of allowing up to around 500 to 1,000 plus players. This is more than Final Fantasy XIV, SWTOR, ESO, and Guild Wars 2, and nearly every other modern MMO are capable of in multiple zones. I repeat, more than any other modern massive MMO, right, is capable of, which kind of calls into question the whole terminology in the first place. To go back a little bit, according to the creators of Asheron's Call, what massive meant to them in 1999 was a few hundred players on screen. However, they admitted in their tell-all that they were able to easily surpass that and get into the thousands. Asheron's Call launched in October 1999. However, because MMORPGs became more prominent quickly, it sort of gobbled up the other idea that existed at the time of online RPGs that weren't massive. Not only did not all online RPGs at the time focus on being massive, they literally couldn't focus on being massive. There would be some pretty significant titles that would come out of the early 2000s that would end up basically changing the entire industry that weren't massive. Enter ORPGs or co-RPGs or whatever you would prefer to name them. That's not really the important part. The important part is their impact and significance. That was just literally true. These games were not only called differently, they were designed differently. In the early 2000s, there was a branch of online RPG that wasn't specifically focused on being massive, whether for technical reasons, like in the case of my first example, or because of a desire to appeal to a different type of online player, like both of my examples exhibit. The first example and game we've already covered. It's Phantasy Star Online. Yuji Naka of the Sonic Team fame would go on to revolutionize the online market with this game, being the first major online Japanese title period, and still to this day, one of the most well-known. PSO originally launched back in Japan in 2000 and changed the landscape of online RPGs from then to now. What's so unique about PSO was the combination of higher fidelity graphics and action-style combat, two things that people weren't really used to playing in an online format. PSO didn't have massive zones, in fact you had to load into the zones individually, and allowed for groups of up to only 4 players. This is by the way the exact same design Dragon Quest X had, which is the MMO that Yoshi P designed before Final Fantasy XIV. But PSO's whole thing, according to Yuji, was, well, they couldn't make or sell an MMO if they tried, technically, since they were strapped for time, but also because the Japanese market for the time didn't even have online play widespread. In fact, when they gave out the Dreamcast console, they had to bundle it with the console for free. So PSO's success came from the fact that it wasn't an online massive RPG. It never tried to be, and still has dictated and shaped games today, including Monster Hunter World and even Dragon's Dogma. Now my second example is a Western example, and is still as genre-defining and world-changing as an online RPG that wasn't massive. It's none other than Guild Wars 1. Guild Wars 1 was developed by ArenaNet and published by MMO royalty developer NCSoft back in 2005. Guild Wars 1 was not only massively successful, pun not intended, it did such while not being a massive RPG. In fact, ArenaNet made it a point to tell players they weren't designing an MMO. They were designing something closer to a cooperative RPG experience. They were also the first to bring forth channels, which would later evolve into phasing. Guild Wars 1 would go on to be so successful that it resulted in a sequel later on that copied pretty much the exact same core design with some new innovations like open zones and open questing from Warhammer Online. The strange thing about the emergence and later success of the MMORPG or ORPG or less massive online RPG market was that their initial successes were super impressive, but the genre's dominance wouldn't come until much later. That's because 2003 and 4 and on would have some of the biggest massive online RPGs launched ever. So much so that blockbusters like WoW, which I don't even need to explain the acronym because it's that famous of a game, would change the entire industry. Suddenly the desire for massive titles would skyrocket, and every major IP and gaming company or publisher was attempting one of their own and promising that. The dominance of the MMORPG market, specifically the massive variant, would span for a solid decade at least, with WildStar being the very last major MMORPG, not New World, to launch back in 2014. This era is incredibly long and complex, and I have covered tons of failures and successes from that period of time on my channel. However, like my videos detail, there were many issues in the rush for gold and being the next massive online RPG. While the story is unique, many of these titles failed to understand what building a world or massive online RPG would take. In their rushes for gold, they would misunderstand the genre and the complexities therein, making it the most complex genre of gaming by far. But it wasn't just developer or user error. It was a combination of lack of technology, availability, and a much smaller market share made being a massive online RPG just more difficult on a base level. That's where people felt like over time, technology would cheapen and things would advance, making massive online RPGs easier and more accessible. However, what developers realized during that reign of massive online RPGs was that there was a serious lack of actual RPG in these games, and a focus on story and the smaller player experiences. With the success of the PSO franchise and the Guild Wars franchise, there was a blueprint that already existed to make tons of money, and a successful game, while not being constrained by the same issues of being a massive online RPG. Despite being known as the MMO guy, if you know me, you know that PSO and Guild Wars 1 are two of my favorite games ever, top 10 games. My death of a game on PSO I dubbed a love letter to the franchise, and the only reason that I haven't done a death of a game on Guild Wars 1 is honestly because it's quite emotional for me. That's why this crusade matters more to me than just education, I can admit, right? but not in the way people think. What it means to me is telling people that my favorite games were different, and that's how they were able to be successful. With the rise of online RPGs like Guild Wars 2, and specifically the rise of Japanese online RPGs like Animal Crossing, Dragon's Dogma, Phantasy Star, Monster Hunter, Final Fantasy XIV, and suddenly, non-massive online RPGs were thrust back into the limelight in a massive way. Damn it, all these massive puns probably aren't helping my position. Yoshi P's formula for turning a failing Final Fantasy XIV, which was, by the way, more massive in every single way previously, if you ever played or followed my video of Life of a Game on Final Fantasy XIV, but his formula was well established at this point. They heavily studied WoW, but unlike some fans will unjustly state, Yoshi P even argues against this, they didn't just copy WoW. No, they brought the Final Fantasy flair, plus a more specialized approach to a smaller, more focused world. Something WoW had shifted to more later on, to compete by the way. This is the Japanese online RPG formula. Historically, Japanese developers don't make massive online RPGs. In fact, I challenge you to look one up and find one for yourself. And you'll struggle, because the Japanese market is not the same as the Korean market, known as the pioneer in the MMORPG space. In fact, for the lols, go to the front page of Final Fantasy XIV and notice that MMORPG isn't anywhere in sight. Why? Well, Japan is responsible for PSO after all, which arguably created the entire genre itself. So many other Japanese developers in their online RPGs followed in the same footsteps and took little effort to make their games massive. This is cultural. Games are culture. This had such an impact globally and not just in Japan, however. It even shifted some Western games entirely to mimic this style or approach, such as ESO or SWTOR. Whether those were natural decisions to shrink the massive parts of those games because it just wasn't working, or the market shifting more towards a less massive online RPG as a whole, I think Final Fantasy XIV can be said to be the massive catalyst for all in that respect. While none of this detracts from my position, which is less of a position and more so informing people what already has existed historically, despite people routinely ignoring that Yoshi P has direct quotes of being in understanding of this, because the games, if you want to call them all MMORPGs, they're just not the same. So then what's the use in doing that? Yoshi P expressed interest in making a massive online RPG, but that it would take a lot of work and the right business solution due to need of roleplay actors. Now, what does he mean by that? That last part is key. What Yoshi P means is that his game Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy XIV don't rely on roleplay actors, but in the context of a massive world, players more so serve as the apparatus for content and experience, which is less common in less massive online RPGs, which rely more on single player or small scale story and interaction with NPCs over players. Which means, despite fans feeling like I'm attacking their baby anytime I mention it, Yoshi P's actually quite aware that Final Fantasy XIV is not a massive online RPG, at least not in the literal sense. It doesn't need roleplay actors after all. He made the distinction, right? But the distinction is important because MMORPGs were created with the need for roleplay actors, so that's kind of how they all were. So if you make arguments about Final Fantasy XIV in the comments or Discord and you don't mention Yoshi P's position on it, and the fact that he had to change the game to fit his position more so, I'm not gonna take you that seriously, just being completely honest. It's like trying to talk about periodic tables and the other person doesn't even think they're real. So why does the distinction between these two styles of online RPGs matter so much, besides nerdSlayer creating an evil, light Yagami, secret rhetoric to shame people of either genre, or hate on Final Fantasy XIV in secret, or seed chaos, or whatever else, despite greatly enjoying both and believing they serve great but different purposes? People have to construct delusional realities sometimes that I hate less massive online RPGs, despite having thousands of hours in all of the ones that I referenced, just because I'm asking people to evaluate what you're playing and what that stands for. I love online RPGs, period. That can't be taken away from me. That's whether they're massive or not. They both, however, offer very clear strengths over each other, and attract similar but different types of players. They also, from design perspectives, are designed differently. Not only do I know this from studying design, I know it from consulting and alpha or beta testing nearly all major MMORPGs. Take that or leave it, but go talk to somebody who's in the industry and see if they know what I'm talking about. My last video was, the funny thing about it I guess, is that it was discussing a soloable world, not solo players. So for anybody conflating it to being a solo player and saying it was an attack on you, you misinterpreted the entire video starting from the title. I had many players posting that they didn't have time to play massive online RPGs, for example, or that they preferred to not really play with others, which was just confusing. Because not only has this existed before online RPGs were even popular, and even before MMOs existed, they're literally the most popular right now. Online RPGs are, so it's a total non-issue. The analogy I think that's quite fitting and funny is team sports. Now, I know a lot of people don't like sports, but bear with me here. Imagine playing basketball and a guy suddenly tells you that he can't play much teamwork because he has a family, kids, and a life. Well, most people would probably just respond, that's life. And you're not really supposed to dedicate yourself to this game to just play it for fun. But at the end of the day, it's still a team game. So you deciding not wanting to be a team player in a team-based game doesn't actually make any sense and wouldn't fly, especially in my experience playing basketball growing up. That's the argument I'm making, that massive MMORPGs are more like a team sport that needs teamwork. And online RPGs, the non-massive ones, are like playing horse or knockout, basketball games that don't require a team or teamwork. It's just weird to see so many non-massive online RPGs get offended by such, and maybe you could argue it's just misunderstanding the actual content. Whereas massive online RPG fans don't even really complain about this, and they don't even have any games to play right now. They should be mad if anything. So you're taking to the comment section to act as if you're being persecuted as a solo player or a player without time, because you don't actually understand my position. Meanwhile, non-massive RPGs that focus on players like you are the norm, meaning they already won. There is no persecution, solo, small scale, or whatever else going on right now. But that's part of the problem though, is solo-centric players, whether from issues, in real life stuff, or just personal preferences or whatever else, play plenty of solo-focused online RPGs and find fun in them. Especially right now. There's like 6 major ones. But those players I've noticed also find the need and desire to speak for other players who enjoy the more massive teamwork variant, as if that makes much sense. It's like playing squad without a mic and a proper lobby. You will be 100% kicked because teamwork and communications on good servers are non-negotiable. I could still see how that would hurt a solo player's feelings, but the squad community ultimately doesn't care because it's their game and their design supports it. That's why the distinction matters and why I was making it consistently throughout the video. A massive online RPG is not the same as just an online RPG. In Squad, for example, if you played an online RPG based on that, you would probably want to be notified if it was so serious and team focused, right? Versus more individually focused. So when I mentioned that solo players can be selfish, I meant solo players playing a massive teamwork-focused MMO, expecting to get the exact same experience as those who are actually cooperating, is selfish and probably not optimizing their level of play. I say that as a solo player, because that's just life. The other technical and thus logical thing that can't be denied, for there needing to be a distinction, is because massive online RPGs are focused on fitting multiple hundreds if not thousands of players on screen. All of the original major MMORPGs managed to accomplish this in the early 2000s. But they were also less focused on personal story, solo play, and more focused on your involvement in the world and the experiences therein. And there were some issues with that. Because of these things, they often can't have as good graphics or gameplay though, and they have to compromise greatly for performance. That was the point I was making when talking about Final Fantasy XIV's Shadowbringers being so highly touted versus like Final Fantasy 15 or 16 or hell, even go watch the most recent Final Fantasy VII or remake gameplay. I mean, just check out the gameplay on screen. Tell me if that looks anything as fluid or clear or pretty or whatever other adjectives you'd like to use as Final Fantasy XIV. Now, before you sit there and say, yeah, but strategy, I've been playing MMOs my entire life. The reason that Final Fantasy XIV is the way it is not because of strategy. Despite not actually arguing against my points, like the gameplay and graphics and story, people just feel like I'm shitting on Shadowbringers, which is just silly. Because they say things like, well, as an online RPG, it was rated high, and it was rated higher than these other games. Yeah, because it's being rated on a scale. If you're gonna be honest about it, you should be aware of that. Having a favorite game that you like more that's not rated as high as another game is totally fine, but you don't have to paint some weird narrative about it. See, online RPGs that aren't massive don't have to deal with the same kinds of issues. It's why historically they've always been the best looking and best functioning of the types of games. To put this into perspective, when PSO came out, it was like Elden Ring today in terms of fidelity. Well, we haven't played anything like that at the time, especially for online RPG fans. Online RPGs are still kind of doing that sort of thing today, pushing the envelope of story content and gameplay, or in ways that the massive ones just simply can't. This allows well-established IPs, which are all the successful online RPGs right now, to leverage their already massive lore and audiences. In the case of Final Fantasy XIV and SWTOR, both games had to make serious efforts to shrink their worlds in order to make them functional, and for the games to survive. In the case of Final Fantasy XIV, that would go on to great success, which is why I recommend watching my Life of a Game on the video, which talks about how Yoshi P and his team were able to do it. A simple example is they had to reduce the amount of pixels it required to display certain objects and graphics on screen because it was just too bad for performance. Anyway, the thing that I want people to take away from this video is the following. If you want to build a game to be massive as possible, things like graphics and involvement in gameplay are going to be lessened due to technical reasons. The less massive you build your game, the more you can focus on these aspects. Imagine if Final Fantasy XIV didn't have to waste time with any of the MMO trappings of the previous iteration, and frankly the issues of latencies and engine issues, well, it would function literally the same. However, pretty much better in every single aspect. There wouldn't be any more complaints about 1 to 50 being boring, or stuff like the game gets good at expansion 3. Things like that don't exist in Final Fantasy games. Imagine if SWTOR actually delivered on what they promised too, and had more of a focus on the class story and interactions with the player. Imagine if it really was KOTOR 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These are realities that could have happened had these games focused far more on what I'm discussing, and less of the former, and later changing their designs, which both games had to do in significant ways. So if you like that, there's nothing wrong with that. The point is that it could have been better. So while these games offer plenty that's redeemable, and Final Fantasy XIV specifically is widely regarded and successful, by better defining these games it not only helps us understand what the differences between them are, it actually helps the industry make better games going forward. A final note about the comparisons between the two. On both sides, but especially the Final Fantasy XIV side, stop trying to say one is better than the other, or weirdly creating divides where there doesn't need to be them. I've seen this from both massive and non-massive fans both engaging in this, creating weird culture wars over preferences. My previous video about soloable MMOs and being social in an MMO were not to create divide, but to explain to people that there's a difference between playing an online RPG as a solo-centric player and playing a massive one. And that playing and expecting the latter to cater to you explicitly past a very short point, remember it should still cater to you. It's a point that Yoshi and I both agree on strongly, but past a point it can't, because it just doesn't make logical sense. The whole point is that these two types of online RPG services service different types of players, but sometimes the same. So there is overlap, so it's not about fighting each other. Solo players in massive worlds are a whole other thing I can talk about in another video, because they also present very interesting perspectives to the MMO industry. So I'd like to apologize for any of the actual solo players who even play MMOs as solo players, because you were not who I was talking about. Because you guys already understand what you're getting yourself into. How do I know that? I'll explain that in a second. Ignorance, though, creates a divide there that becomes toxic. But when you properly educate yourself, you kind of realize in the end it's just really about your preference. If you're satisfied with non-massive RPGs, then right now you're probably delighted with the current crop of games, and with those to come out in the future. So you don't need to defend your favorite online RPG's honor, unless you just want to boost my engagement. Massive online RPGs are a little more on the ropes though, and perhaps that's where some of the contention comes from and people thinking I'm choosing sides. But I also think that some of it comes from people not wanting to call these two types of games anything different, thinking that it's some kind of insult. Which I'm sorry, just demonstrates that you're not understanding the concepts that I outlined here and I've outlined before. So you might be wondering, which should you play? Well, like I just said, it's preference. Find the one that aligns the best with your preferences, in particular game or world that you're the most interested in. So relax on trying to create any persecution on any side of the coin. Having less time means that online RPGs are going to be more attractive to you, but it doesn't mean you can't play massive ones either. The industry was built on people with jobs playing massive RPGs, trust me. If you're like me, that means that you pick more specifically based on the game itself, and not because the game's massive or not. But I still have desires to play massive online RPGs, and make sure that people understand them and their differences between the less massive ones. That will always be something that I desire. Having a preference over one or the other for whatever your personal reasons are, just let me know in the comments below. That's ultimately your decision, and nobody's judging you for it. That's where I think people just took my last video wrong, despite me in the video literally stating it wasn't my intention. Sometimes people just stop watching a video as soon as they hear something they don't like, or something that challenges their position. Wanting to play an online game alone might not be optimal, in any context actually, but it's your choice, so there's no need to defend that against anybody. The point is that perhaps there's games that you would specifically enjoy more that are better suited for you, like the ones I mentioned in the video, the online RPGs, the ones you're playing already. And look, if you want to say that you can call Final Fantasy XIV an MMORPG, then sure, look, okay, I'll relax. You can call it that. But you can't not acknowledge it's fundamentally not designed like most of them, which shouldn't really offend anyone, right? If you admit either of those, right? It works, remember? Now, if you're playing a massive variant one, think Ultima Online, or Asheron's Call, or EverQuest, or Darkfall, or EVE Online. These worlds try to be more like worlds, so playing solo in them is going to be an incredibly difficult and different experience. How do I know this? As I was mentioning, I have decades and thousands of hours of experiences to back that up. As a solo player. This is my reverse Uno card that I've been saving this entire time, because I didn't mention it in the video before. I'm gonna leave you guys with something funny, at least funny to me. Not only do I love MMORPGs as I've already established, I love MMORPGs. I even love and support solo play. I was a solo PKer for over 10 years, and I played the first 2 social online games that I found, Habbo Hotel and Galaxies, as a solo player. No matter my preferences or whatever logic or story I tell people, me playing an online massive RPG as a solo player was never the most optimal. That shouldn't hurt your feelings to hear the truth. It doesn't hurt mine despite living it. Especially when right now we're speaking, you can go play games that don't care if you're a solo player, like SWTOR. You can beat the entire game by yourself. My experiences as a solo player and lover of both massive and non-massive online RPGs makes me feel quite qualified to speak on these sorts of subjects. In the future, I will put a video out that highlights more about solo players themselves and their thought processes individually, which, to be clear again, was not what my intention was with my last video. I'd like to thank you for watching this video. If you want to debate or attack my argument, please demonstrate in your post that you watched the video. Or present an argument, because if you don't, I'm not gonna reply. And that goes for any platform. I will probably meme and ban you too, just an FYI. I seek discussion and furthering truth as much as I can, whether that's debate or friendly discourse. I'm aggressive about this ideology too, sorry. That makes me come across as just aggressive in general or try hard, I get it. But I was raised on the internet, and this is the kind of environment I enjoy and want to foster. Blame the internet. But without online RPGs and playing massive online RPGs as a solo player, I would have never learned how to socialize. That's just the truth. That's why it means so much to me. And I want other people to be able to experience that too, especially the benefits from it, because those benefits last throughout your entire life. Thanks for watching.